not care for the city's restaurants. Dallas repaid the courtesy when Fort Worth built an airport between the two cities and named it Carter Field. Dallas residents declined to use the airport, in large part because of the name, and the airport eventually failed. There was and is such a rivalry between the two cities that the only project they ever cooperated on is the current airport. Planners were careful not to name it after anyone from either city. The visiting reporters had no interest in airports, of course. What they did want to know about was a local after-hours joint called The Cellar. The Cellar had no liquor license, but if you were a friend of the owner, a former stock car racer named Pat Kirkwood, the drink of choice Kool-Aid was spiked with grain alcohol, and it was on the house. It was not the drinks, but the fact that the Cellar's waitresses wore only their underwear that had given the place some notoriety, and the notoriety had apparently spread as far as Washington. Hippies and free love would descend on San Francisco, and Kirkwood always claimed his place was the forerunner of what was to come. Whatever the case, Phil Record, the Star-Telegram Night City editor, and I were appointed to guide our visitors to it. It seemed like a good idea at the time and must have been quite an evening. I remember we stayed long enough for some of the Easterners to see their first Fort Worth sunrise. A group of off-duty Secret Service agents joined us, and in months to come there would be congressional hearings into whether the visit had left them as alert as they should have been the next day in Dallas. Having no assignment the next day, I could afford to sleep late, which was my normal practice anyway. I was the oldest of 3 children, and my father had died when I was in college, so I still lived in my mother's house, helping her to make a home for my brother Tom and my sister Sharon. Tom had been 10 when Dad died, and Sharon 15. But by the time Kennedy came to Texas, Tom was in high school, and it was Tom who shook me awake shouting, "Kennedy has been shot. You'd better get to work." Tom had been allowed to miss school that day, and he and Mother had driven into town early to see the President as he emerged from the Chamber of Commerce breakfast. As Kennedy walked out of the Texas hotel and toward his car, Tom had been one of the last people in Fort Worth to shake his hand. Within hours and before they had returned home, Kennedy had been shot. I dressed as quickly as I could, grabbed my black felt snap-brimmed Dick Tracy hat, and roared off in my 2-seater Triumph TR4 sports car. As I parked in the lot near the Star-Telegram office, the radio confirmed the worst. The President was dead. It was as if someone had hit me with a hammer. At once I was stunned, hurt, and embarrassed. Stunned because such violence was unthinkable in those days. Hurt and embarrassed because it had happened in my home state. Why did something like this have to happen, and why did it have to happen in Texas? As I made my way inside, lines of people 2 and 3 across were already surrounding the Star-Telegram building. The Kennedy assassination would be the first story that the entire nation would watch together on television, and because of it, television would soon replace newspapers as the place where most Americans got their news. But when Kennedy was shot, people still really didn't believe the news unless they saw it written down in black and white. So hundreds waited outside the Star-Telegram for the special editions that rolled off the presses. The truth was we couldn't print them fast enough, said one of our editors. People would stand in line to buy one edition, then go to the back of the line to buy a copy of the next one. They were the last of the great newspaper extras, and they would come to symbolize the end of the newspaper era. Inside the city room, it was bedlam. When the flash that Kennedy had been shot had hit the wires, an editor had dispatched so many reporters to Dallas that there was no one left on the city desk to answer the phones, and they were all ringing. Nonetheless, one of the editors told me to get to the police station. A man carrying a load of dynamite in his car had been arrested leaving Dallas County and was being brought to the Fort Worth jail. He was the best suspect so far in the Kennedy shooting. I managed to get to the police station just as he was being brought down the back stairs. Early in my police reporting days, I learned a trick from the cops. People will sometimes blurt out the truth if they're surprised by the question. So I jumped in front of the handcuffed suspect who was between two detectives and shouted, "You son of a bitch, why did you do it?" "Well, I didn't," he said, as the cops hustled him into the lockup. In a matter of hours, it would become clear that the poor man had done nothing and knew no more about the assassination than the rest of us. He had stopped for gas at a service station between Dallas and Fort Worth and mentioned to the attendant what he had heard on the radio, that the president had been shot. The attendant hadn't heard about it and called the cops, figuring the only person who could have known about the shooting was the one who had done it. When police stopped the man's car and found the trunk loaded with dynamite, it was enough for them, too. As the afternoon wore on, it was determined that the man was exactly who he said he was, a demolition contractor who was en route to a construction job. Had it happened today, it would have triggered dozens of lawsuits against the city and the police, and at least the threat of one against me. But the police apologized, and the man said no problem, and went on his way. When I got back to the city room, the confusion was worse than ever. By now, a dozen Star-Telegram reporters were on the scene in Dallas, but when they called in, there was no one on the city desk to answer the phones and take down the stories they were trying to call in. I hadn't even removed my hat when I settled behind a typewriter and picked up one of the ringing phones. In all my years as a reporter, I would never again take a call like that one. A woman's voice asked if we could spare anyone to give her a ride to Dallas. "Lady," I said, "this is not a taxi, and besides, the president has been shot." "I know," she said. "They think my son is the one who shot him." It was the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, and she had heard on the radio of her son's arrest. "Where do you live?" I blurted out. "I'll be right over to get you." Why she called the Star-Telegram that day remains a mystery. She had lived a vagabond life during most of Oswald's childhood, but she had eventually settled in Fort Worth, and when Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union, Star-Telegram reporters had interviewed her. We would also later learn that just a week before the assassination, she had been working as a governess in the home of Star-Telegram founder Amon Carter's son. The family had had no idea she was the mother of a defector, but had discharged her because the children complained that she was mean. Whether those connections prompted her call, we never knew, nor did I know any of that as I began to think about how I was going to get her to Dallas. Somehow, taking her there in a two-seater open sports car just didn't seem quite right. Which led me to the desk of Bill Foster, the paper's automotive editor. For years, local car dealers had furnished the auto editor with a new car and gas to fuel it. It was offered and accepted without embarrassment, with the understanding that the auto editor would road test the car and write up the results in his Sunday column. Not surprisingly, the reviews were usually favorable. When Bill told me he was driving a Cadillac sedan that week, I said, "Come on, I'll explain as we go, and you're going to like it." We found Mrs. Oswald on the lawn of a small home on Fort Worth's west side. She was a short, round-faced woman in enormous black horn-rimmed glasses and a white nurse's uniform. She carried a small blue travel bag. I got in the back seat with her, and Bill drove. She was distraught, but in an odd way. I would later come to believe she was mentally deranged, but for most of the trip she seemed less concerned with the death of the president and for her son than with herself. She railed about how Oswald's Russian-born wife would get sympathy, while no one would remember the mother, and that she would probably starve. I marked it off to understandable emotional overload, and I couldn't bring myself to use her self-serving remarks in the story I filed later that day. I probably should have. She would later be so brazen as to tell a reporter for Life magazine that Mama wants money. And years later, she was still